A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Have you ever found yourself staring at your phone at 2 in the morning, watching that little green lightning bolt, and wondering if you should pull the plug at 80%? Or maybe you've actually set an alarm for it. I know people who do. They treat their smartphone like a sourdough starter that needs constant monitoring.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn, I have definitely been that person. It is a specific kind of anxiety, isn't it? This feeling that if you let it hit 100%, you are shaving weeks off the life of a $1,000 device. Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly that. The electrochemistry of getting the best out of our batteries, from the phone in your pocket to those massive industrial torches and even electric vehicles.
It is funny because batteries are basically the only part of our tech that feels like a living thing. The processor doesn't get tired, the screen doesn't get sick, but the battery, it has a lifespan. It decays. And because we are so dependent on these things, we've developed all these rituals, most of which, I suspect, are about as scientifically grounded as throwing salt over your shoulder. By the way, fun fact for the listeners, Google Gemini 3 Flash is actually writing our script today, so we are leaning on some high-level compute to parse this chemistry.
It is the perfect marriage of topics because the AI models we use are trained on hardware that is increasingly reliant on the same power management principles we are talking about today. But to your point about rituals, we really need to move past the old wives' tales phase of battery care. We are living in 2026. We aren't dealing with the nickel-cadmium bricks from the 1990s anymore.
Right, the old memory effect days. I remember being told you had to run your Game Boy into the ground before you could even think about touching the charger, otherwise the battery would forget how much capacity it had. Is that still a thing?
Not at all. That is probably the biggest piece of zombie information out there. Nickel-cadmium batteries actually did suffer from a crystalline buildup if they weren't fully discharged, which effectively lowered their capacity. But lithium-ion, which powers virtually everything we use now, doesn't have a memory. You can top it off at 40%, 60%, or 95%, and the chemistry couldn't care less about the memory. In fact, as we will get into, shallow discharges are actually much better for the health of the cell than waiting for it to die.
So, if the memory effect is a myth, why are we still told not to charge to 100%? If I buy a battery with 5,000 milliamp hours of capacity, I want to use all 5,000 of them. Why is the top 20% considered the danger zone?
It comes down to physical stress and chemical stability. Think of a lithium-ion battery like a pair of sponges, the anode and the cathode. When you charge the battery, you are physically moving lithium ions from the cathode over to the anode, which is usually made of graphite. When you get close to 100%, you are trying to cram every last lithium ion into that graphite lattice. It is crowded in there.
So it is a literal space issue? Like trying to fit one more person into an elevator that is already at capacity?
Very much so. At the atomic level, that graphite structure actually expands as it accepts those ions. When you force it to full capacity, you are putting mechanical strain on the material. Do that enough times and the structure starts to crack. But the bigger issue is the voltage. As you push toward 100%, the voltage required to move those ions increases. High voltage is essentially a high-stress environment for the liquid electrolyte inside the battery. It starts to decompose, forming what we call the solid electrolyte interface, or SEI layer.
I have heard of the SEI layer. That is the stuff that builds up on the electrodes, right? Like plaque on teeth?
That is a decent way to visualize it. A little bit of SEI is actually necessary. It protects the electrode. But when it grows too thick because of high voltage and heat, it acts like a barrier. It makes it harder for the ions to move back and forth. That is why your old phone might say it is at 100%, but it dies in 2 hours. The capacity is technically there, but the pipes are so clogged that the battery can't deliver the energy efficiently.
So when Daniel asks if we should avoid charging above 80%, the answer is a scientific yes, because that last 20% is where the most clogging and straining happens. But man, it is a hassle. I don't want to live my life staring at a charging indicator.
And you shouldn't have to. The good news is that the industry has finally caught up to the chemistry. If you look at a modern iPhone or a Samsung Galaxy or even a Google Pixel, they have these optimized charging features. They learn your sleep patterns. The phone will charge to 80% quickly, then it will literally sit there and wait. It won't push that last 20% until about 30 minutes before it thinks you are going to wake up.
Which is clever because it minimizes the amount of time the battery spends in that high-stress, high-voltage state. It is like only putting that extra person in the crowded elevator right before the doors close, rather than making them stand there for 8 hours.
Well, I shouldn't say exactly, I promised I wouldn't use that word, but that is the logic. And in 2025 and 2026, we've seen these hard 80% limits become standard. You can go into your settings and just tell the phone, never go above 80. For most people, 80% of a modern battery is more than enough to get through a day. If you plan on keeping your phone for 4 or 5 years, that one toggle is the single most effective thing you can do.
What about the bottom end? Daniel mentioned the 20-80 rule. We talked about the 80, but what happens at the 20? Is letting your phone die actually killing it, or is that another old wives' tale?
That one is actually very real, and potentially more dangerous than the high end. When a lithium-ion battery drops to true 0 volts, the chemistry can become unstable. Copper from the current collector can start to dissolve into the electrolyte. Then, when you try to charge it back up, that copper can precipitate out and form dendrites, tiny microscopic spikes.
Spikes? That sounds like something that leads to the spontaneous combustion headlines we see every few years.
It can. If a dendrite grows long enough to bridge the gap between the anode and the cathode, you get an internal short circuit. That is when you get thermal runaway. Now, to be clear, your phone has a battery management system, or BMS, that prevents this. When your phone says 0% and shuts off, the battery isn't actually at 0 volts. It has a safety buffer. But if you leave a dead phone in a drawer for 6 months, it will naturally self-discharge. If it drops below that safety buffer into a deep discharge state, the BMS might actually lock the battery for safety, and it will never charge again.
So the advice is, don't be a hero. Don't try to squeeze every last drop out of the battery. If you're at 15%, find a plug.
Yes, the sweet spot is that middle range. Think of it like a rubber band. If you keep a rubber band slightly stretched in the middle, it lasts forever. If you stretch it to its absolute limit or let it go completely limp and crinkly, it starts to lose its elasticity.
Okay, so we've got the voltage stress and the physical strain. But what about heat? Daniel mentioned that heat is the primary killer of battery health. I feel like we notice this most with fast charging. My phone gets significantly warmer when I'm using one of those 100-watt bricks versus an old 5-watt cube. Is the convenience of fast charging a buy now, pay later scheme for battery health?
It can be, but again, the engineering is getting much better. Fast charging is essentially a race. You are shoving ions across that electrolyte as fast as possible. That movement creates friction and internal resistance, which generates heat. And heat accelerates every bad chemical reaction we've talked about. It speeds up the decomposition of the electrolyte and the growth of that SEI plaque.
So if I fast charge every single day, I am definitely hurting the battery more than if I used a slow charger.
Theoretically, yes. However, modern BMS systems are incredibly conservative. They will throttle the speed as the temperature rises. Also, have you noticed how your phone charges super fast from 0 to 50%, but then slows down significantly after 80?
Oh, for sure. It feels like the last 10% takes as long as the first 50.
That is by design. When the battery is empty, there are plenty of open seats in the graphite anode for the lithium ions to land. You can throw them in there fast. But as it fills up, it becomes harder to find an empty spot. If you keep pushing high current when the battery is nearly full, the ions can't find a spot in the lattice fast enough, and they start to plate onto the surface of the anode as metallic lithium. That is a permanent loss of capacity and a major safety risk.
So, the slowdown at the end is the phone's way of preventing lithium plating. It is basically saying, slow down. We need to find a parking spot for these ions.
Precisely. And this is why I tell people not to worry too much about fast charging for their daily driver if they only keep their phone for 2 years. The BMS is smart enough to prevent a catastrophe. But if you're the type of person who wants their phone to last 5 years, or if you're talking about a very expensive piece of gear like a high-end LED torch or an EV, then yes, avoiding heat and ultra-fast charging whenever possible is the move.
Let's talk about those other devices for a second. Daniel brought up large torches, flashlights for the lay people, and EVs. I have one of those massive industrial torches for camping. It uses 18650 cells, which are basically the workhorses of the lithium world. If I leave that torch fully charged in my garage all summer, what am I doing to it?
You are essentially slow cooking it. Heat plus high state of charge is the perfect storm for battery degradation. If you store a lithium-ion battery at 100% in a hot environment, say 35 or 40 degrees Celsius, you can see a permanent capacity loss of 20% in just a few months.
20% just from sitting there? That is brutal.
It is. The chemical reactions that break down the electrolyte are activated by heat. The higher the voltage, meaning the higher the charge, the more fuel those reactions have. If you have an emergency kit or a torch you only use once a year, the pro tip is to store it at about 50% charge in a cool, dry place. That is the point of maximum stability for the chemistry.
It is funny because that is exactly how new phones come in the box. They're always at 50 or 60%. I always thought they were just being cheap with the electricity, but it's actually for shelf life.
It is entirely for shelf life. If they shipped them at 100% and they sat in a warehouse for 6 months, the customer would open a new phone with a degraded battery.
Now, let's look at the big stuff. Electric vehicles. This is where the 2080 rule really moved into the mainstream. Tesla and Rivian actually build this into the user interface. They have a daily range and a trip range.
And that is such a smart way to frame it for the consumer. They are essentially saying, look, for 90% of your life, you don't need the full capacity of this massive battery pack. So let's keep it in the happy zone. By limiting the daily charge to 80%, they are ensuring that the battery pack might last 15 or 20 years instead of 8 or 10.
But here is the catch. If I'm always staying between 20 and 80, am I not effectively losing 40% of the range I paid for? It feels like I'm buying a car with a 20-gallon tank, but only being allowed to use 12 gallons.
I get that frustration, but it is more about longevity. If you use the full 20 gallons every single day, within 5 years, your 20-gallon tank might only hold 15 gallons because of degradation. If you stay in the middle, your tank stays the same size for a decade. Plus, EV manufacturers are even more clever with their buffers. When a Tesla says 100%, it is often not the true physical 100% of the cells. There is a top buffer and a bottom buffer that the user can't even touch.
So they're building in a safety margin to protect us from ourselves.
They have to. Replacing an EV battery pack is a $15,000 job. They want to make sure that doesn't happen during the warranty period. But what I find fascinating is the second-order effects of this. We are seeing these same principles applied to grid-scale storage now. When you have a massive battery farm backing up a city's solar array, they aren't cycling those batteries 0 to 100. They are managing them with surgical precision to maximize the return on energy invested.
It makes me wonder if our charging habits are going to become a thing of the past as solid-state batteries come online. We've been hearing about solid-state for a decade, but it feels like we are finally getting close. Does the chemistry change there?
It changes significantly. Solid state replaces that liquid electrolyte, the stuff that decomposes and catches fire, with a solid ceramic or polymer layer. This should, in theory, allow for much higher voltages and faster charging without the same level of degradation or fire risk. But until that is in every pocket and every garage, we are stuck with the limitations of liquid electrolytes.
One thing Daniel mentioned that I want to double-check is calibration. He suggested charging to 100% once a month to recalibrate the BMS. Is that real, or is that just another ritual?
That one is actually real, but not for the reason people think. It doesn't help the battery, it helps the computer that is watching the battery. Over time, the BMS can get a little drift in its estimations. It is trying to track ions, but it is an imperfect science. By hitting a full 100% and then letting it drop low, you are giving the BMS2 anchor points to recalibrate its sensors. It ensures that when your phone says 5%, it actually means 5% and doesn't just die unexpectedly.
So it's like resetting the trip odometer on your car. It doesn't make the car run better, but it makes the fuel gauge more accurate.
Oops, I did it again. Yes, that is a perfect analogy.
I'll allow it this once. So, let's summarize the actionable stuff for people who aren't chemistry nerds. Because honestly, some of this is a bit overwhelming. If I take one thing away from this, is it just stop worrying and let the software handle it?
Mostly, yes. For your smartphone, the best thing you can do is enable the optimized charging or 80% limit in your settings and then forget about it. Stop setting alarms. Stop waking up at 3 a.m. to unplug your phone. The software engineers at Apple and Samsung are much better at managing your battery than you are.
That is a relief. I think people have a lot of tech guilt, where they feel like they are failing their devices.
Definitely. But there are a few things the software can't fix. The biggest one is heat. If you're in a car on a hot day, don't leave your phone on the dashboard running GPS while it's charging. That is a triple threat of ambient heat from the sun, heat from the screen and processor, and heat from the charging. That is how you balloon a battery.
Oh man, I've seen the spicy pillow effect. When the battery actually physically expands and pushes the screen out of the frame. That is terrifying.
It is. That is the internal pressure of the decomposed electrolyte gases. If you see that, the battery is no longer a battery. It's a safety hazard. Get it out of your house immediately.
So, avoid the dashboard slow cooker. What about the 20% rule? Should I be paranoid about letting my phone hit 15?
Don't be paranoid, but don't make a habit of it. If you're at 20% and you're near a charger, just plug it in. There is no benefit to waiting until it's lower. Shallow cycles are the secret to a long life. It is much better to charge from 40 to 70% 3 times a day than to charge from 0 to 90% once a day.
That is actually very counterintuitive. Most people think plugging in frequently is bad.
It's the opposite. Think of it as microcharging. Small bursts of energy are very easy for the battery to handle. It keeps the voltage in that plateau where the chemistry is most stable.
What about the large torch example? For people with emergency gear or power tools that sit in the garage.
Store them at 50%. If you have a cordless drill and you aren't going to use it for the next 3 months, don't leave the battery on the charger and don't leave it empty. Hit that middle ground. And if you can, bring them inside. A garage that hits 40 degrees in the summer is a graveyard for lithium-ion.
It's interesting how much this has changed. I remember in episode 1598, when we talked about the battery bottleneck, we were mostly complaining about why batteries haven't gotten better in terms of capacity. But today's discussion makes me realize that while the chemistry hasn't changed that much, the management has become incredibly sophisticated.
It really has. We are squeezing more life out of the same basic lithium cobalt oxide or lithium iron phosphate chemistries just by being smarter about how we treat them. And that is a huge win for sustainability too. If every smartphone in the world lasted 4 years instead of 2 because of better charging habits, that is a massive reduction in e-waste and lithium mining.
It's a rare case where being lazy, just letting the software do its thing, is actually the most environmentally friendly and technically correct move.
It's the ultimate win-win, but I do think we need to keep an eye on the right to repair side of this. As batteries become better managed, manufacturers are also making them harder to replace. If your battery is glued into the frame, it doesn't matter how well you treat it. Eventually, it will die, and if you can't swap it, the whole device is e-waste.
That's a whole other rabbit hole. But for now, I'm just happy I can stop feeling guilty about my midnight charging habits. I'm going to go home, turn on that 80% limit, and sleep like a baby.
Just don't forget to charge to 100 once a month for the calibration, remember?
Right. I'll put it on the calendar. Calibration Day. We can make it a national holiday.
I'm in. We can celebrate by all unplugging our devices at the same time and watching the world's power grid breathe a sigh of relief.
Before we wrap up, I want to look at one more thing Daniel touched on. different chemistries. He mentioned sodium-ion and LFP. We've been talking about lithium-ion as a catch-all, but are the rules different for these newer types?
That is a great catch. LFP, or lithium iron phosphate, is becoming huge, especially in cheaper EVs and home storage like the Tesla Powerwall. LFP is actually much tougher than the standard nickel manganese cobalt chemistry in our phones. You can charge LFP to 100% every day with very little penalty. In fact, many LFP vehicles recommend it so the BMS can stay calibrated.
See, this is why people get confused. The rules are literally opposite depending on what flavor of lithium you have.
It is a bit of a minefield. But for 99% of consumer electronics, phones, laptops, tablets, you are dealing with the high energy density cobalt-based chemistries. And for those, the 2080 rule is king. Sodium ion is the one I'm excited about for the future. It's cheaper, it uses salt instead of lithium, and it's much less sensitive to temperature. We might be able to leave our sodium ion phones in the car without them turning into spicy pillows.
A phone powered by table salt. The future is weird, Herman.
It's weird and it's wonderful. But until then, keep your gadgets cool, keep them in the middle, and trust the BMS.
Words to live by. I think we've successfully separated the folklore from the science today. No more memory effect. Talk at the dinner table.
Agreed. It's time to retire the 19th century battery myths.
Well, that about covers it for our deep dive into the world of ions and anodes. Thanks to Daniel for the prompt. It's one of those topics that affects every single one of us every single day, whether we're thinking about it or not.
And honestly, it's a relief to know that the best thing to do is often just to do nothing and let the automation handle it.
My favorite kind of advice. Big thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a huge thanks to Madal for providing the GPU credits that power the AI models making the show possible.
This has been my weird prompts. If you found this useful, or if you're now going to go scavenge through your settings to find that 80% toggle, do us a favor and leave a review on your podcast app. It really does help other people find the show.
We are also on Telegram. Just search for My Weird Prompts to get notified the second a new episode drops.
Until next time, stay charged, but not too charged.
Stay in the sweet spot. Bye!
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the flows from sloth.